All right. As part of our program today, we're going to share with you some mysteries, if you would, stories of some characters and tales that are appropriate for the Halloween time. If you look in your historian, that was just, well, unfortunately, we had a little mix up with the post office, so they just started arriving today. There's an article in there, The Legend of the Purple Lady, which sort of sets the tone for today's presentation. It was as a child growing up, and my sister wrote this article, and it deals with Elmwood Plantation, which was at the corner of Boardman Avenue and North Beach Boulevard. And at one time, my uncle owned that property, and then across the street, my parents owned the property there, which is talked about in the article. And we had this legend of the Purple Lady that would make scary times for us as we would roam around at night. They didn't have street lights back in those days to speak of. And so you always had the fear of the Purple Lady lurking in the various oak trees and pine trees as we moved about. And it went on from my generation to when my younger daughter would have friends over, and we'd tell the story and tell them to go walk around and see. Well, they'd get about maybe 100 feet from the house, and then they'd come running back. The Purple Lady was definitely out there. So it's a fun article, and the what's interesting about it, my sister wrote it, but the story was passed on to her by some of the property caretakers that were on the property back in the early 1900s when my grandparents bought the property, not the Elmwood, but the one adjacent to it. And those folks continued to be involved in the properties for a couple of generations. So it's true fiction, for lack of a better word. Alternative truths, I think, is the contemporary term for some of this. But anyway, so that sets a tone, I guess, for what we're going to do next. So I'm going to ask Jim Codling to come up and introduce some of the folks you're going to hear from today.
Thank you, Chris. Usually we have a speaker come, as you know, and give you a talk on something. So this time we're going to switch up a little things and be more entertaining perhaps, although I think all our speakers have been entertaining. But what we're going to do today is give you an anthology, if that's the right word. Where's Eddie? Is that the right word? A number of different stories. Anthology, the right word? Number of different stories?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I got it right. I had to ask my English specialist. And so we're going to give a number of different stories of either something that happened on Halloween or some character. Jim is going to portray a phantom barber of Pascagoula, and that's going to give you a preview of what we're going to do on Halloween evening over in the cemetery. And then I'll give you a story about what actually did happen on All Saints' Day back in 1755. Bev is going to read a story about the Isle of Capri and some ghostly experiences there. And Bert is going to give a story about a ghostly grandmother. And Ron is going to give his talk on David Posey. And if anyone else has a very scary or interesting or even a factual story about somebody, you are invited to participate as well. Just let me know. Okay, so I'm going to ask Bert to come first, if you won't mind, Bert.
The story's about my Uncle Melvin, who is my dad's only brother. He was written about briefly in the Growing Up Downtown book. His name was Melvin Young. And some of you may have remembered him. He rode around on a three-wheel bike, and he wore a reflective vest because he kept getting hit by cars that didn't see him. But the sad part of the story is that my grandmother, his mother, who he lived with, went to take a bath and didn't get out. I mean, and Melvin found her, and it was quite traumatic. And so after the funeral, and he went back and lived alone in the house. He had never lived alone here in Bay St. Louis, or anywhere else for that matter. And so there was a period of adjustment. He was sad, and as someone who lost a parent would be. And he was sitting in the living room of the house several weeks after my grandmother was buried. And she walked in. And he said she didn't say anything. He said, "Mama?" She just looked at him. And the story goes that she sat down, stayed a little while, and then vanished. And my dad says that his brother, Melvin, who was really kind of a mess after my grandmother died, after that event, he brightened up and he started riding his bike around Bay St. Louis, made friends with everybody, and would go to 3 different churches every Sunday because he loved people. But it had a happy outcome. Yeah.
My name is Billy Dolan, and I'm a mean, badass guy from Pascagoula. But everybody back in the day knew me as the Phantom Barber of Pascagoula. And I brought my scissors. I'm going to tell you why it makes a scary tale. But back in the 1930s, when there was no air conditioning, people lived with their windows open, and there'd only be a screen between the inside and the outside of the house. Well, Phantom Barber of Pascagoula used to like to cut through those screens, creep into the house of little girls, and go to their bedside and cut off a lock of hair without waking them up. What a sicko I was. Then take the lock as a treasured keepsake, creep out of the house, and nobody would know I was there until the next morning when the little girl looked in the mirror and went, "Mama, the Phantom Barber was in my bedroom last night." Well, after I did this 2 or 3 times, the whole neighborhood went bonzo. They were looking for me, but they never got me then. Unfortunately, by 1942, I had been doing a few other crimes, and I got convicted, and I went to Parchment Jail for 10 years. Well, I came back in 1952, maybe not reformed, but settled here in Bay St. Louis with family and friends, right in the neighborhood. And then one day I disappeared, and nobody knew where I was. A little later, a body floated down the river, all bloated, chained to a wooden pier, part of a pier. Well, they fished me out of the river, brought me over to the funeral home, and family and friends, they identified me. Now, I was looking pretty ugly. But they said, that's him. So they buried me right here in the Cedar Rest Cemetery in an unmarked grave. And that might have been the end of the tale of the Phantom Barber from Pascagoula. But a week later, the FBI sent the sheriff a message. The fingerprints of that corpse you buried in the cemetery ain't Billy Dolan. And everybody said, well, who was it? Nobody knows. And that means the barber might still be walking around. But that was a long time ago. But anyway, that's the tale of the Phantom Barber from Pascagoula. Now, if you'd like to visit me again, hear my story again, come on down to the Cedar Rest Cemetery on Halloween night. And you can hear the story again. But if you can't wait, you may come to our cemetery tonight around midnight, and I'll give you a haircut.
We have this little booklet for the non-inflationary price of $5, which has some local ghost stories, some from Waveland, but then some from beyond down the coast. And there's a story about the bourgeois house in Waveland that was lost in Camille, but supposedly ghosts there. It was known as the Haunted House of Waveland. And then, of course, if you're local, you certainly know the story about Pirate House and all the stories that are told about it. Eddie can tell you that sometimes Kate Lebrano seems to make an appearance here.
Really, she does.
She's kind and wonderful, but Eddie says that every once in a while,
Yeah,
he knows she's been here.
I'll tell them one more thing about that.
Yes.
All right, you see, this is where our computer set. There was a woman who was also a member of the society, and she was also president of the Historical Society. And she always worked 3 days a week that I will work. We would both be sitting here typing and, doing stuff. All of a sudden, we'd both stop and turn around and look at the same time. And I looked at her, I said, Jackie, what was that? She said, I don't know, but I heard it too. And I turned around. And she still does that sometimes in here. What happened this morning? Somebody said, what's going on out there? I said, that's just Kate moving around here. So I do not believe in ghosts. I did not grow up believing in ghosts. I did not grow up on Halloween and go Halloweening and all of that, because you can't do that in the country. I grew up in the country. There was no place to go. So we didn't do that. So I didn't grow up with, like a lot of you, living in the big city or even in Waveland or Bay St. Louis, and expecting to do stuff on Halloween. There was no place to go trick-or-treat. All right, I just wanted to tell you that about that.
Back in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And my other story is...
There's also a story about the 100-Man Hall, which is kind of a fun story, which I had never heard before. But I decided to go down the beach some to the Isle of Caprice. And if you have never heard about the Isle of Caprice, it is a fascinating story. It's the appropriate name for this mysterious stretch of land. As Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary states, a caprice is a sudden, impulsive change in the way one thinks or acts, a whim. Indeed, the island seemed to appear and then disappear on a whim. The Isle of Caprice is still MIA above the water, but the island, once known as Dog Island, lies beneath the waves about 12 miles offshore between East Ship and Horn Island. It was there in 1847, then vanished a decade later. It popped up again 50 years later, just in time for the Roaring Twenties. In 1926, the Isle of Caprice opened as a resort, offering dancing, surf bathing, boating, fishing, and games, according to advertisements, with gambling and drinking as the real unadvertised incentives. Booze was not sold on the island, but guests were welcome to BYOB or buy it from the private boats that just happened to be in the neighborhood. Records indicate that the Isle of Caprice had a high-kicking time until the 1-2 punch of erosion and the Great Depression did it in the early 1930s. Eventually, the island went back underwater. Geologists say this disappearing act can be attributed to erosion and the shifting underwater sands. But why let details and facts get in the way of a good story? There's a local legend that a storm was on its way from the Gulf, headed straight to the island. Still, the party went on, with folks opting to stay on the island rather than to head to the mainland. The storm struck the island with fury. 2 days later, rescuers left Biloxi to reach those who had stayed. But all they found when they got there to the island had been the bodies and the debris floating in the water. The island had disappeared and there were no survivors. According to the legend, if you go out to the area where the Isle of Caprice lies between the surface of the Gulf, you can hear rowdy laughter abruptly replaced with terrified screams and then total silence.
Beverly didn't tell you, but she's the one who put together that little booklet as well as writing the 2 plays that we put on this past year. And we have one actor over here who played in the...
And Chris.
And Chris.
And you.
Well, no, this was the first one.
Oh, the first one, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. That was the Mercy Train. And then she wrote another one for this year. And so Chris and I, played in that one. That was the... what's it called again?
Sink or Be Sunk.
Sink or Be Sunk, which is in your historian if you want to read about that or see the pictures from it. So I just want to give Bev a little kudo, and let's give her a round. I'm going to tell you a true story, and I know you think, oh yeah, everything's true. But this is actually what happened on All Saints' Day in Lisbon, Portugal in 1755. Anybody been to Lisbon? Okay, so you know what Lisbon looks like today. Well, back in 1755, Lisbon was a medieval town with very narrow streets. It was a very compact city, but it was also the center of Portuguese wealth. The British and the Germans had great banks there in that city, and they brought commerce from all over. And if you recall, Portugal was one of the sea powers at that time, along with Spain. And when the Pope decided to cut the world in half and give half to Portugal and half to Spain, that's where Brazil speaks Portuguese and the rest of Latin America speaks Spanish. Well, in Lisbon, it sits right on a fault line. The Mediterranean is known for its disasters, and you think of Pompeii and other such disasters. And so earthquakes are prone in that area. Well, on All Saints' Day, 1755, all the good Roman Catholic children and parents got up and they went to the cathedral. Now, the cathedrals were built in a medieval state, that is, that they were made out of stone and a little drafty. So in order to keep the draft down, they hung tapestries, whichever way you pronounce it, from the wall, all over the church, the cathedral. And then on All Saints' Day, they lit candles. And so all these candles were lit all around the cathedral. All of a sudden, an earthquake struck. The tapestries fell onto the candles. The churches went up in flame. The people ran out into the streets. But as I told you, the streets were long and narrow. And the buildings began to crumble and shake. And things began to fall on all the people that were running into the street. So they said, where can we go to escape all this? Oh, let's go to the wharf. Let's go to the river. It's going to be safe there because it's open. There's nothing to fall on us. So they people ran out to that area. All of a sudden, a 15-foot tsunami came up the river and 60,000 people died on that All Saints' Day in Lisbon, Portugal. The Jesuits said, it was God's will that you suffer because of this. And so the Jesuits were never ever liked again in Portugal. Comte said, well, what you shouldn't do is build your house where there's going to be an earthquake. You shouldn't build near the coast. So all you people living in Waveland and Bay St. Louis and Pascagoula and everywhere else, y'all are making a mistake. But that's the story of Lisbon, Portugal. And they learned a lot from that, how to build houses and how not to live on the coast. But we never did actually learn that, did we? Because we're all on the coast. Well, that's the story of Lisbon, Portugal. 1755. Now I'll call on Ron to give a story on David Posey.
Oh, I'm tired and I want to go to bed. Had a little drink about an hour ago and it went right to my head. When I have some of this moonshine from up in the kiln, I kind of get a little loud, rowdy, and I think I'm funny. And I'll say things like, here's to the girl that steals a kiss and runs to tell her mother. She's a foolish, foolish girl, and she shan't get another. But when I don't have my booze, I'm a pretty good guy. My name is David Posey, and I came from Brookhaven, Mississippi. I was hired by the Ingram Day Lumber Company to come down here to Hancock County and build a railroad road for their lumber. And I brought my wife with me and my family. And life was good, but except once in a while, I'd get on the booze and I'd do something stupid. Well, it was a balmy Sunday day. And I'm going down the road in my automobile, and I got a couple of the men that work with me that are black men, and we're just having a good old time, hooting it up and talking. And we run into some more people, and we stop the car, and it gets a little bit louder. And about that time, Deputy Sheriff Oscar Farr shows up, and he tells me that I'm being loud and rowdy and disorderly, and I need to take it down a notch and go home. Now, the two black men that were with me, they'd been around, they knew it immediately just to be quiet and respectful. Not me. I said, Oscar Farr, I built this road, and I'll do any damn thing I want on this road. And Oscar Farr pulled out his 6-shooter, and he pulled the trigger, and he shot me dead. Well, they found my body the next morning lying side the road. Now, I don't want to tell you about the good old boy system here in Hancock County, but I feel a little obligated to tell you about the good old boy system here in Hancock County. They buried me here in the cemetery next to some of my family, and then that spring they had a trial. Now catch this. The prosecutor going after me, his name was Gex, G-E-X. The man that was going to defend me, his name was Gex, G-E-X. They were brothers. The judge was Judge Ainsley. Now, those of you that live here, you know there's a big section of the county called Ainsley. And the sheriff's name was Farr. Guess what? He was acquitted. Now, I don't hold it against him, but it did make it tough on my wife and the 6 children. And I always like to tell this when I'd be drinking a little bit and I was at home, I'd tell my wife, here's to the girl that steals a kiss and stays to get another. She's a foolish, foolish girl, and soon she'll be a mother. And she was 6 times. But anyway, I'm buried here in the cemetery with my family, and just like that man from Pascagoula that cut hair, if you'd like to hear this story again, come see us on Halloween night.
Now is your opportunity. If you have a ghostly story to tell, let me know. I'm looking for hands. In that case, I'll have to tell another story. Some of you may not know, but I was a missionary to the Saulteaux up in Canada. We used to call them Indians, but you can't do that anymore. So, I was told this story from a number of people that I visited quite frequently, but to no avail. And as I visited them, they told me that they were sitting and drinking one Halloween night. And as they sat there, all of a sudden, it got stormy outside. The shutters started shaking. The door started waving back and forth. All of a sudden, it blew open. And there, in front of them, stood a figure, all red, with horns on his head. And he walked up to them and slapped them all in the faces and disappeared. Well, I thought they would have learned from that they weren't supposed to be drinking so much, but it didn't help them one little bit. They were all drunk as a skunk last time I visited them.
Are we going to Patty's?